was a beautiful person.
He definitely wanted to change the world for the better.
Found viciously beaten to death.
32 lacerations to the face and body.
He had suffered a crushed trachea.
Police uncover a trail of evidence and search for a brutal killer.
The volume of blood told the story of how far the struggle went.
There were numerous items of evidence seized.
Several suspects emerge.
We did receive tips that it was a professional hit.
He was doing work that might have threatened someone enough that they murdered him.
I knew him to be someone who would maybe not want to cross.
Until the case takes a jaw-dropping turn.
And then a bombshell was dropped.
We thought that we were really onto something, and that kind of fell apart.
And the truth is revealed.
You're telling the family that you've arrested the right people.
We were back to square one.
She wasn't telling us all this stuff out of the goodness of her heart.
It just didn't sound like it could be possible.
Norwich is a small city in eastern Connecticut, known as the Rose of New England.
The city of Norwich is an old mill town. It's not as affluent as the rest of Connecticut. There's poverty here, you know, there's hard luck here. But overall, it's a good city. It's one of those places that doesn't change much.
But on the night of May 14th, 2004, Norwich was shaken to its core by a horrible crime.
911. I was coming here to look at an apartment and there's someone laying on the ground. He's not moving and he looks like he's dead.
Police and paramedics race to the scene.
They found a white male in his 50s. There was a lot of blood. It was a horrific scene. The paramedic indicated that the unresponsive person was deceased. Upon arrival at the scene, we could tell that there was a vicious beating with numerous strikes to the face with some unknown object.
He had suffered quite a lot of injuries to his face and neck. And there was a pattern on his clothing. It looked like it may have been shoe impressions.
There may have been a case of someone either stepping or stomping upon the victim.
The victim's shoes were missing, a wallet, and some other items were missing that he would have normally had.
The missing items suggest a robbery. But what explains the viciousness of the attack?
The volume of blood told the story of how far the struggle went from the side of the house to a car parked in the driveway. The violent struggle had moved throughout the backyard to the location where the body was found. There's always a possibility that it was a random crime, but the manner of death did raise our suspicions about it being possibly more of a personal nature.
The forensic team gets to work.
They collected the blood, hair, fiber, evidence, anything that they could find at the scene.
But this crime scene poses unique challenges for investigators.
The property itself appeared to have been in the process of being cleaned up.
There was a lot of debris. There was broken glass, and there was metal, there was, bike parts.
It was difficult to see if any of that material had anything to do with the crime scene. We did not determine the murder weapon at the scene.
There were numerous items of evidence seized.
We saw a hose in the backyard that had blood on it. A keychain was found at the scene and a brick with some apparent blood residue. The situation with the house told us that the victim was not residing in the house.
Detectives turned to the 911 caller for a statement.
She said she had seen a for rent sign, and she called the number.
The woman who answered said that her husband, the owner, was at the house.
She says, "Oh yeah, my husband's down there working on the property. We should go talk to him."
So she went to the property and discovered the body in the driveway. She dialed 911 at approximately 10:55 p.m.
Police now believe the victim is the owner of the rental property, New Hampshire resident Eugene Maloff.
I conveyed that information to the New Hampshire police, and they were able to notify Joanne Maloff that we had discovered someone that appeared to be her husband.
I received a call at 2 o'clock in the morning from Joanne. And she said, Eugene's been murdered. And it just didn't sound like it could be possible, like it was a bad dream. It just rocked my world.
"56-year-old Eugene Maloff was born and raised in Norwich.
Eugene and I were very close, all through grade school, high school. We just loved each other's company. He was just a down-to-earth, sensitive, nice guy.
Okay, come on. Let's do our standard dance.
Eugene and his wife Joanne were married young and soon after started a family.
Joanne was made for Eugene. They were both very outgoing and had a lot of warmth. Eugene was always very loving to the kids, just very gregarious and sweet. We knew from a very, very young age that he was a genius.
He got his education from Harvard and then MIT, and he had a doctorate in environmental engineering.
He wrote books about outer space and nuclear energy. There aren't many people like him who can both understand the science and communicate the science.
After completing his PhD, Eugene embraced cold fusion, a controversial theory about limitless energy.
Gene got deeply involved in cold fusion, which was contrary to a lot of conventional thought at the time. If cold fusion realizes its potential, you would have unlimited alternative energy. Gene definitely wanted to change the world for the better.
Gene was trying to follow his dream and go on the path less chosen, and he was working on new ways that we could stop global warming and have a better world.
All right, there we are. That's our little house.
Eugene always told his parents that he wanted them to keep the house in Norwich. He was sentimental and he just loved those old memories.
Now, the house that held Eugene's fondest memories had become the scene of his family's worst nightmare.
That was the house that he grew up in, and although he moved to New Hampshire, he had kept the family property and had rented it out for years.
Detectives call Eugene's wife, Joanne, and question her about her husband's last known movements.
She said on this particular day, he had come down to clean up the property, making sure that it was all suitable for renters. And he had a dumpster delivered. Joanne Maloff had spoken to her husband earlier that afternoon, and in fact, she had expected he would be home in New Hampshire by 9 o'clock or so that evening.
Police learned that Eugene had driven his minivan to Norwich that day.
She described the van, and it had some unique markings on it, and also had New Hampshire plates. Mrs. Maloff said the van should have been on the property.
But there was no van in the driveway.
The first thing you're thinking of is that the killer had taken off with Mr. Maloff's van.
He's a family man murdered and brutally beaten. I think that shocks the conscience of any neighborhood.
We felt that whoever was driving that van was complicit with the homicide of Dr. Maloff.
Coming up, investigators uncover conflicting evidence.
They had been involved in a theft of a motor vehicle and some kind of violent struggle.
Blood was sent to the laboratory, but there was no match. It wasn't logical.
and disturbing secrets.
I realized that there were people out there that weren't happy with Jean.
Whose blood is that and where did it come from?
He wanted to commit suicide and was shaking and hyperventilating.
Some of the things regarding her whereabouts on the night of the murder hadn't added up.
I had to accept it, but it was a terrible thing.
Nuclear scientist Eugene Maloff has been found violently beaten to death at the rental property he owns. And police suspect the killer fled in his van.
We put out a bolo, be on the lookout to all the local police departments for the van.
While detectives wait for news on the van, they interview neighbors.
The purpose of the neighborhood canvass to try and figure out when was the last time Mr. Maloff was seen alive.
We spoke to a neighborhood friend of Dr. Maloff. He indicated that he had seen him mowing the lawn earlier that day, and nothing was suspicious at the time. He did indicate that at about 8:30 p.m. that evening, the van was not there, which gave us a time frame to start working with.
Dr. Maloff had been mowing the lawn. Everything had grass cuttings covering it, from abandoned bicycles and debris on the ground, but there wasn't a stitch of grass on these keys. So we believe that those keys were dropped after Dr. Maloff had mowed the lawn, which would have been sometime around the time of the homicide.
Detectives hope neighbors can help them identify the owner of the keys. But then, police receive an urgent call from a local casino.
We were notified that Dr. Maloff's van had been located in the employee parking lot of the Foxwoods Casino, which was approximately 7 miles away from the crime scene. When we arrived, the tailpipe was cold as if it had been there for several hours. The van was towed back to the City of Norwich Public Works Garage so that the State Police Major Crime Unit could process the van.
They searched the van for hairs, fibers, and anything that looked like blood.
They didn't obtain any fingerprints from the door handles or steering wheel, which indicated to us that the driver quite possibly was wearing gloves.
Investigators hope security footage will help them identify the driver of Eugene's van.
It was a hazy, foggy evening, and we weren't able to gather much evidence at all from the cameras at the Foxwoods Casino.
With the killer still at large, police turn their attention to Eugene's wife, Joanne, in New Hampshire.
Probably a 3-hour drive from New Hampshire to the crime scene. The Maloff family, they had alibis, and they were not suspects at this time. Joanne Maloff couldn't provide anybody's name that would have any intention of hurting her husband.
Police asked Joanne for information about recent tenants at Eugene's rental property in Norwich.
We needed to obtain the identity of all individuals that lived in the house. They were definitely persons of interest. Joanne Maloff told us that Jean had evicted Pat and Roy Anderson approximately 2 weeks prior to the murder.
Jean's tenants stopped paying the rent, and Eugene eventually had to look into how to get them out, because I think they were there for a good 6 months before they actually left. Jean didn't want to be cruel to people, and I think he really gave them a lot of leeway, but enough is enough.
For detectives, it's the first break in the investigation.
Pat and Roy Anderson had been living at Mr. Maloff's property for a long period of time, up till the eviction.
My immediate questions were, where are the people that were evicted? How do we locate the Andersons?
Luckily, a tip from a neighbor leads police to the Andersons' son, Chad Schaefer, who lives nearby with his girlfriend, Candace Foster.
One of the investigators went to their apartment to get information about Chad's mom and dad, Pat and Roy.
The purpose of his interview was to determine whether or not the Andersons had seen Gene Maloff on the property, if they had seen him, when they had last seen him,
Chad claims that his parents had not seen Eugene since he served them the eviction notice.
Chad Schaefer said there were no hard feelings between the Andersons and Gene Maloff.
Police asked Chad for his whereabouts on the night of the murder.
Chad and Candace indicated that they were both home with their newborn on the night in question, and that was their alibi.
Chad cooperates with police and provides them with his parents' new address.
I subsequently went out to Pat and Roy Anderson's new rental out in Montville, Connecticut, and interviewed them about Gene's death. Pat Anderson, she corroborated Chad Schaefer's assessment that when they were evicted, they moved on and there was no feelings of animosity between themselves and Gene Maloff.
Detectives still want to know where the Andersons were at the time of the murder.
Patricia Anderson worked in a nursing home. Ian said she was at home after working previously during the day.
Police ask Roy point blank if he has an alibi around the time that Eugene was murdered.
He indicated that he had worked from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning out at the Foxwoods Casino. And Dr. Maloff's van had been located in the employee parking lot of the Foxwoods Casino.
That was very suspicious to the investigator. From the crime scene to the Foxwoods Casino parking lot, it's not far, a 15-minute drive. And then you're thinking maybe this eviction thing was a personal thing. And we have as investigators to figure out who did it so that person can be held accountable.
Police investigating the murder of cold fusion scientist Eugene Maloff now have their first real suspect. His recently evicted tenant, Roy Anderson, works at the same casino where Eugene's stolen van was found on the night of the murder.
Roy reported that there was no animosity about the eviction. There was no problem between Eugene and Roy. But Dr. Maloff's van had been found at the Foxwoods lot.
Angered by the eviction, had Roy killed Eugene in revenge?
We got a list of names of employees that night, and we verified that Roy Anderson was in fact working from 5 p.m. until 1 a.m., and that provided him with a pretty solid alibi that he was not within the city of Norwich at all. Pat and Roy Anderson were both individuals of interest, but they had alibis.
Police want to know if anyone else was living in their house at the time of the eviction.
One of the things that we learned in talking to Pat and Roy, they would bring other people in to help pay for rooms.
We needed to obtain the location of all individuals that lived in the house.
It turns out one of the Andersons' subletters is well known to police.
Lenny Campbell was a friend of Roy's, and they allowed Lenny to stay in the basement of the house.
I personally had run into him a few times during the course of my patrol duties. I knew him to be an individual that someone would maybe not want to cross. The Andersons, when they were evicted, Lenny moved out with them to their new place.
Police want to speak to Lenny, but the Andersons say he recently packed up and left without an explanation.
He moved out shortly after Eugene's murder, and investigators thought it was suspicious.
When police try to track Lenny down, they find he's moved out of state.
Lenny Campbell was working on a farm up in Massachusetts. Lenny denied ever even having contact with Eugene Maloff.
Lenny isn't talking, and there's no evidence connecting him to the crime scene.
At this point in the investigation, we really need some solid forensic evidence that somebody was complicit in the murder of Eugene Maloff.
Police receive the autopsy report, and it sheds more light on how Eugene was killed.
The medical examiner's office indicated approximately 32 lacerations to the face and body.
And he had suffered a crushed trachea.
What possibly could have sparked such a vicious assault?
We did receive tips throughout the course of the investigation saying that it was a professional hit.
Was Eugene assassinated for his research into alternative energy?
I thought that perhaps because cold fusion was so controversial, that maybe it was some kind of planned setup.
I do believe there's always a danger to somebody that's going to rock the boat. I realized that Gene's passion for countering big oil meant that there were plenty of people out there that weren't happy with Gene.
It occurred to me that, he was doing work that might have threatened someone enough that it would have murdered him.
We delved into it, and based on the crime scene and the circumstances in which he was killed, I don't think a professional hitman would go about his business in that manner. It just didn't add up. It wasn't logical.
Police are running out of leads, but then a witness comes forward with a bizarre account from the night of the murder.
We came in contact with a shuttle driver for a nearby hotel sometime between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. on the night of the murder. He had pulled up to a traffic light and saw a van similar to the doctor's van, and he noticed the operator of the van, a white male, was wearing socks on his hands.
Obviously, you start to think, well, if the person's wearing socks on their hands, they don't want to transfer any evidence onto a steering wheel.
Whoever was driving that van with hands covered with socks was possibly complicit with the homicide. Gene Maloff's van had been moved into a fenced-in compound, and we examined it again for anything that we may have missed or the state police may have missed, and we seized a few items to include a plastic bag.
Police submit the bag to the state forensic lab for analysis.
And as a result of that, a fingerprint came back. It was the first piece of evidence that would place somebody in that van, possibly on the night of the murder.
The print is run through the police database.
The fingerprint belonged to a local individual from the Norwich area.
When we ran this person's record, they had a record of burglaries.
He was the type of guy that wouldn't have any problems breaking into your car. Maybe Eugene Maloff got killed for it.
Police have a fresh lead in the murder of Eugene Maloff. A fingerprint on a plastic bag found in the scientist's stolen van is matched to a local car burglar.
The results of that examination indicated that a print on the bag belonged to a Nicholas Gardner.
Police track the suspect down and bring him in for questioning.
He was very nonchalant about the fact that he had broken into the van, but when it was brought to his attention that that vehicle was used following a homicide, his demeanor shifted dramatically, and he became very nervous at that point.
When police grill him further, he makes a startling admission.
He said that he broke into a police impound lot.
He explained that he had broken into the impound lot and was burglarizing the cars. And that would explain how his fingerprints had been found in Mr. Maloff's van.
Police confirm his story when his prints are found on other vehicles in the lot.
Nicholas was definitely wrong place, wrong time, and had no clue that the van that he was entering was involved in the homicide of Gene Maloff.
Nicholas is charged with the burglaries, but it's a dead end in the search for Eugene's killer. Then, police get a call that reignites the case.
We received a phone call from the New Britain Police Department, 40 minutes away from the city of Norwich. A New Britain police officer had come in contact with two subjects. They were in a parking lot. They were asleep in the vehicle. It was a stolen vehicle. It had been reported stolen the same night of Dr. Maloff's murder.
When the officer looked inside the car, he made an alarming discovery.
They had been found with blood inside their vehicle. And so obviously the first inclination is, whose blood is that and where did it come from?
The men are arrested and taken to the station.
When they were taken into custody, they were identified as Joseph Riley and Gary McAvoy. Officers at the scene observed that Riley and McAvoy had evidence of some kind of violent struggle.
Is it possible these two men were involved in Eugene's murder?
We wanted to either rule them into our homicide scene or rule them out.
So investigators from Norwich went up and spoke with Riley and McAvoy at the lockup in New Britain.
Police interview Riley and McAvoy in separate rooms. They press Riley about the bloodstains in the car and scratches on his arms and legs.
Joe Riley told the detectives that he and McAvoy ended up in an altercation with one another.
They both said that they got into a fight in the car, and that's how they had the blood in the car.
Investigators question the pair about Eugene's homicide.
During Riley's interview, he made some statements that really caught our attention. He asked, did the old man get the kicked out of him? But the manner of death of Gene Maloff had not been relayed to Riley at that time.
How did Riley seem to know details about how Eugene was killed? McAvoy's response to questioning raises more red flags.
When the officer advised him that he was being investigated for potential homicide, Gary McAvoy became very distraught. He indicated that he wanted to commit suicide and at one point curled up in a fetal position on the floor and was shaking and hyperventilating.
The statements provided by Riley and McAvoy were suspicious to the investigators.
Police bring in the hotel shuttle driver who claimed he saw someone driving Eugene's van on the night of the murder.
He told us that the operator of the van was a white male.
A photo array was offered to the witness, and he pointed out to Joseph Riley as the driver of the minivan that he saw that night.
Police now have a witness placing one of their suspects inside Eugene Maloff's van on the night he was murdered.
Riley and McAvoy had been involved in a theft of a motor vehicle and a burglary, and they did have evidence of violent struggle, and the witness picks Riley out of a photo lineup.
Police still lack physical evidence, so they obtain the men's DNA to compare to samples collected from the crime scene and the van.
Evidence was sent up to the Connecticut State Police Forensic Laboratory.
When results come back, it's a major break.
We received a phone call from the forensic lab saying that the hair in Mr. Maloff's van was a match to Mr. McAvoy. Okay, well, that's a blockbuster.
We had solid forensic evidence, and we're going to move forward with a warrant.
Riley and McAvoy are charged with Eugene's murder.
I was happy for the family that maybe they'd get some closure on this case.
But then, investigators receive a disturbing call.
We thought we were on strong footing based on the solid forensic evidence from the van, and the case was going to move forward. And then a bombshell was dropped.
And Gary McAvoy are charged for the murder of Eugene Maloff after one of McAvoy's hairs is matched to a hair found in Eugene's van. But then, police receive news that rocks the case.
Bombshell was dropped by the state forensic lab. The lab reached out to us and said there was a mistake and that McAvoy's hair was not at the crime scene and were not in the van.
There was a clerical error at the laboratory.
And somewhere at the lab, there was confusion over the item numbers. So the hair fiber they tested, they thought came from the van, in fact, came from the hair of the suspects up in prison. And as a result, the state of Connecticut decided they were not going to pursue homicide charges against Riley or McAvoy.
We thought that we were really onto something, and that kind of fell apart.
At this point, we were back to square one.
You're telling a family who lost a loved one to violent crime that you've arrested the right people. And that falls apart, and then we say to the Maloff family, I'm sorry, we couldn't do better.
I had to accept it, but it was a terrible thing. I would cry on the way to work, and I think when you go through a tragedy, your world becomes very small. Joanne was very upset, and I saw her break down once when we were going someplace. I was following her, and she lost her way. She just was devastated at that point.
When the investigation went on so long, I had a feeling it was just one of those random events, and we would never learn anything more of it. I think I pretty much accepted that.
The case goes cold. Then, 4 years after the murder of Eugene Maloff, the investigation is rebooted. Determined to solve the crime, Norwich PD assigned new resources to the case.
They put a task force together, and I was assigned to work with the state's attorney's office, along with Detective Terry McFadden.
Detective Curtis and I picked up on the case and basically started from day one.
Cold cases are just cases that take longer to solve than others. It was a fresh start, and it let us get to work on finding out who the real killers were.
We had met with the Maloff family and just told them that we were trying to get justice for Eugene, and we were able to secure a reward for information about Mr. Maloff's homicide, and that's not typically seen in every homicide.
The reward is advertised on a large billboard near the interstate.
We worked with the family, and we came up with the best design possible and put a billboard up where we thought that the most people would see Eugene's face and see our message to the public saying we needed help with this investigation.
After just a few weeks, the billboard starts to bring results.
The day I won't forget in this case is when we had a witness come into the police department and explain to me that they had direct information related to the death of Eugene Maloff.
The witness claims to know Candace Foster and Chad Schaefer. Chad is the son of the Andersons, the tenants Eugene evicted.
Jill Sebastian was friends with Candace Foster and Chad Schaefer, and had actually lived with them around that time of Mr. Maloff's murder. She began to tell us about how when they would see reports about Mr. Maloff's murder on the TV, Chad would start getting kind of antsy. And Candace had mentioned to Jill about Chad coming home with bloody clothing around the time of Mr. Maloff's murder.
Investigators are stunned by Jill's statement, but police have no evidence connecting Chad Schaefer to the crime scene.
Early in the investigation, an investigator went to Chad and Candace. They said that on the night of the murder, they had stayed home and there was no evidence to support any connection to Eugene's death.
Police are eager to corroborate Jill's story. Her boyfriend, Keyshawn, agrees to give a statement.
Keyshawn told us that Chad Schaefer confessed to Keyshawn that he had killed Eugene Maloff.
Obviously, it's a significant development in the case. We started to look at Candace Foster and Chad more closely.
Police learned that in the years after the murder, Chad and Candace had separated. They focused their attention on Candace.
The #1 goal for us was to get information from her regarding Chad, being a participant in the murder of Dr. Eugene Maloff.
Police urge Candace to tell them everything she knows.
This is the father of her children that she's now going to be telling us about that participated in a homicide. Candace and Chad had a tumultuous relationship, and she related to us that her biggest fear for her and her children was Chad.
Detectives ask Candace about a piece of physical evidence that could tie Chad to the crime scene.
Candace told us that those keys had been hanging inside the loft at the apartment where Candace and Chad lived. And we happened to find a key ring, similar, at the crime scene.
The information is damning, but investigators suspect that Candace is hiding something.
Some of the things that Candace had said regarding Chad or regarding her whereabouts on the night of the murder hadn't added up. We had to let Candace know that she would have to come clean and explain to us everything she knew about the murder.
When we interviewed her, a little bit of information would come out, and then a little bit more information would come out. And then it reached a point where Candace did tell us someone other than Chad was involved in Mr. Maloff's murder.
Detectives believe Eugene Maloff was killed by his former tenant's son, Chad Schaefer. But Chad's ex-girlfriend, Candace, claims Chad wasn't the only one involved in the brutal murder.
Candace told us that Moselle Brown, he had been at the scene with Chad at the time of Mr. Maloff's murder. Moselle Brown was the cousin of Chad Schaefer.
Chad had been hanging around with Moselle a little bit more often around this time. Moselle Brown had a violent criminal past. We knew of him. We were cautious of him.
Investigators press Candace for more details about events leading up to Eugene's murder. She says it all started when a relative saw Eugene cleaning out the rental unit the Andersons had been evicted from.
Candace told us that all day long, Chad had been getting phone calls from his mom, Patricia Anderson, saying that the landlord was throwing all their things in the garbage. Patricia was really upset and starts putting out pressure on Chad. I told you, you were supposed to get that stuff out of there. You were supposed to have that house cleaned out. I want my belongings. And Chad had gotten picked up by Moselle Brown.
He told Moselle that Mr. Maloff was throwing stuff out that belonged to Chad's parents. They got upset.
And they go over there and they say, listen, we're not gonna take it from this guy. Mr. Maloff says, no, get out of here. I gave you plenty of time to get your stuff out of here, leave. And someone throws a punch. They hit him once, and now once they hit him, these guys don't stop. They just start beating him. And they leave him for dead.
Following the vicious assault, the pair returned to Chad and Candace's apartment.
Candace told us that they returned. And Chad was upset, and Chad had blood on his clothing. And Chad explained to Candace that they had beaten the landlord.
But Candace's account doesn't explain how Eugene's van ended up in the casino parking lot.
Candace wasn't telling us all this stuff out of the goodness of her heart. She was doing this to minimize her involvement and minimize her punishment.
When investigators confront her about her deception, she finally cracks.
From what Candace was telling us, it looked like three of them were involved. Chad Schaefer, Moselle Brown, and Candace Foster.
Candace says she returned to the rental property with Chad and Moselle to cover up their crime.
Candace said they walked down the path to the garage to where they saw Eugene Maloff laying on the ground, and that he was still alive and still breathing, but he was severely beaten. And they realized that they gotta kill him.
Candace Foster was a bit reluctant to do that, at which point they threatened her.
Chad and Moselle said if she didn't participate, that she'd be next.
It was a vicious beating with numerous strikes to the face with some unknown object.
And at that point, Eugene's still alive. And that's when Moselle steps on his throat until he stops breathing.
After killing Eugene, Chad, Moselle, and Candace staged the scene to throw police off their trail.
They wanted to make this look like it was a robbery, and part of that was that Candace drove the van and dropped it off in the casino parking lot.
With Candace's story, investigators believe they have enough evidence to charge Chad and Moselle with murder. They arrest Chad Schaefer first.
When the news came through that they actually had an arrest, it was a shock to find out that Gene was killed by son of a disgruntled tenant. It just seemed unfair.
When investigators track down Moselle Brown, they find out he's serving time in Ohio for another crime.
We extradited him back to Connecticut to face charges for the killing of Eugene Maloff. I believe the X factor was Moselle. He was the violent ringleader, and I believe Chad Schaefer and Candace Foster would not have killed Eugene Maloff in the absence of Moselle.
The three accused are tried separately.
Moselle received more than 50 years in prison. At Chad's trial, he was defiant and ultimately took a plea deal and took the offer the state put on the table.
Chad Schaefer agrees to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter.
Chad Schaefer received a 25-year sentence, and he would have to serve 17.5 years.
Candace Foster is the last to face justice.
There's no way that we could have had as strong a case that we did against Moselle and Chad without Candace. And Candace, with her attorney, made an arrangement with the state's attorney's office for her to receive the sentence that she got.
Candace eventually was charged with hindering prosecution and tampering with evidence.
She served 3 years in jail and then several years of probation.
The verdicts bring closure, but nothing can replace what Gene's loved ones have lost.
I'm not a good judge as to whether justice was served, but the bottom line was that we couldn't bring back that special, wonderful man.
I think Gene would like to be remembered as somebody that advanced the deeper knowledge of the universe.
I think Gene did make a difference in the world. I think he could have made a much bigger difference had he been around longer.
I just miss Gene, and I really relish all the memories I have of all the happy times. We all loved him so much. The world has lost a great human being, a great mind, and a beautiful person.